How does a man walk into a bar and never walk out? No signs of a struggle, no witnesses, and the security cameras. They caught him going in, but never coming out. In 2006, 27-year-old Brian Shaffer stepped into a crowded college bar in Columbus, Ohio, and vanished without a trace. No body, no clues, just a mystery that has haunted investigators for nearly 2 decades. What really happened that night? Let's dive into one of the strangest disappearances in true crime history. The air inside the Ugly Tuna Saloona was thick with the joyous chaos of a Friday night. College students, liberated by the promise of spring break, packed the second-floor bar, their laughter and raised voices a soundtrack to the clinking of beer bottles and the thump of upbeat music. Amidst the revelry stood Ethan, a young medical student from Ohio State, a celebratory pint of craft beer warming his hand. He'd just finished a particularly grueling semester, and the prospect of sun-drenched beaches and carefree days was a welcome balm. But beneath the surface of his anticipation, a quieter ache resonated, the recent loss of his mother still a raw wound. Ethan clinked glasses with his friend Liam, a boisterous psychology major who was already 2 beers deep and enthusiastically recounting a disastrous attempt at online dating. "Seriously, Ethan," Liam slurred good-naturedly. She started talking about her collection of taxidermied squirrels on the first date. Ethan chuckled, the sound a little strained. He appreciated Liam's efforts to lighten the mood, to pull him out of the shadow that grief cast. Across the bar, a news program flickered on a muted television screen. A familiar face flashing across the screen. Brian Shaffer. Even after all these years, the image was instantly recognizable. Ethan vaguely remembered hearing about the case when he was in high school. The medical student who had disappeared from this very bar almost 2 decades ago. He'd always found it chilling, incomprehensible. How could someone simply vanish from a crowded place? The news anchor's voice, though muted, was clearly solemn as the screen displayed the date. April 1st, 2006. Ethan took a long swig of his beer, a shiver tracing down his spine that had nothing to do with the bar's slightly overzealous air conditioning. Tonight was supposed to be about celebrating, about leaving behind the weight of the semester. But Brian Shaffer's ghost seemed to linger in the very air of the Ugly Tuna, a silent question mark hanging heavy in the revelry. Liam, oblivious to Ethan's momentary lapse into somber reflection, was now gesturing wildly as he described his squirrel-loving date. And then, get this, she had names for them: Reginald, Bartholomew, and... Ethan tuned him out for a moment, his gaze drifting back to the muted TV screen. The anchor was now gesturing to a grainy black-and-white image, surveillance footage from inside this very bar, the Ugly Tuna Saloona. Brian Shaffer was a bright second-year medical student at Ohio State University, the muted anchor seemed to declare, the words forming in Ethan's mind despite the lack of sound. He was known for his intelligence, his drive, and the deep love he held for his friends and family. 2006 was a difficult year. His mother had tragically succumbed to cancer, and the grief cast a long shadow over Brian's life. Ethan could relate to that shadow. He knew the suffocating weight of grief, the way it could color even moments of joy with a muted gray. He imagined Brian, perhaps seeking some respite in the excitement of spring break, just like himself. On March 31st, 2006, the anchor continued, the timeline unfolding on screen. Brian made plans to celebrate the start of spring break with his best friend, Clint Florence. Their destination, the Ugly Tuna Saloona. The image on the screen shifted to a bustling scene, the very bar they were currently in, but teeming with people from a different era, their clothes and hairstyles subtly different. It was unsettling to see the familiar surroundings populated by ghosts of the past. The night began innocently enough, the anchor seemed to narrate as the footage played on. Brian and Clint started their evening bar hopping, eventually joining friends at the Ugly Tuna Saloona. Surveillance cameras captured Brian entering the bar at 1:15 a.m. on April 1st. Ethan leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the grainy figure on the screen. It was Brian, younger, with a confident stride, disappearing into the crowd of the bar on the screen. He could almost feel the echoes of that night here, in this same space. Moments later, the anchor continued, the footage showing Brian stepping outside the bar to chat with two women near the entrance. He appeared relaxed, engaged in conversation, even laughing. He seemed to be enjoying himself. The Brian on screen smiled, a genuine, carefree smile that tugged at Ethan's heart. It was a stark reminder of the life that inexplicably vanished. Then, the footage showed Brian turning, his back to the camera, walking back towards the bar's entrance. The video froze. And that, the muted anchor declared, the words practically leaping off the screen, was the last time anyone ever saw Brian Shaffer. The image on the TV screen switched to a stark white text against a black background, the impossible disappearance. A new image flashed, a still frame from the surveillance footage, zoomed in on the bar entrance. Police meticulously reviewed the surveillance footage. What they discovered was nothing short of baffling. Ethan felt a prickle of unease. He knew the story, had heard whispers of it over the years, but seeing it unfold in this way, in the very place where it happened, was different. It felt closer. Brian Shaffer was seen entering the Ugly Tuna Saloona, the muted anchor explained, pointing to the image. But there is no footage of him ever leaving. Liam, finally noticing Ethan's distraction, followed his gaze to the TV screen. "Oh, that Brian Shaffer thing," he said, a hint of morbid curiosity in his voice. "Crazy, right? Just poof." Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes still glued to the screen. The Ugly Tuna Saloona, the anchor continued, was located on the second floor of this building. There was only one public entrance, the very one captured by these cameras. Logically, if Brian had left the bar, he would have been recorded. But he wasn't. The screen split, showing the bar entrance on one side and a red circle with a question mark on the other. So, the question remains, where did Brian Shaffer go? The image shifted again, this time to a montage of faded flyers, missing posters plastered on lampposts and bulletin boards. Brian's youthful face stared out from each poster, a silent plea for help. Brian's disappearance sparked a frantic search, the anchor narrated. His friends and family were devastated, desperate for any clue. They plastered the city with missing person posters, organized search parties, and begged for information. Ethan imagined the raw panic, the heart-wrenching desperation of Brian's loved ones. He thought of his own mother, the gaping hole her absence had left in his life. To lose someone like that, and then to have the added torment of not knowing what happened, was unimaginable. The Columbus Police Department launched an extensive investigation, the anchor continued. They combed through hours of security footage from surrounding businesses. They searched every exit of the bar, even the less obvious ones. They investigated nearby construction sites, considering the possibility of an accident. Another image flashed. Police officers searching a dusty construction site, their faces grim. But the anchor's voice resonated with the weight of unsolved mysteries. They found nothing. No body, no signs of a struggle, no concrete evidence of foul play. It was as if Brian Shaffer had simply vanished into thin air. The screen transitioned to a digital crime board, a chaotic web of red strings connecting photos, timelines, and question marks. As years turned into decades, the mystery of Brian Shaffer's disappearance spawned countless theories. The anchor began to list them off, each one a potential answer, each ultimately unsatisfying. Did Brian leave voluntarily? Some theorized he staged his own disappearance, perhaps overwhelmed by grief and the pressures of medical school. But why abandon his promising future, his loving family? Ethan considered this. Grief could be a powerful force, a desperate desire to escape reality, but to vanish completely, it seemed extreme. Was he murdered? The anchor continued, the image on screen shifting to a darker, more ominous tone. If so, where was the evidence? The Ugly Tuna showed no signs of forced entry, no witnesses reported any altercations. And where was the body? The lack of physical evidence was indeed perplexing. A murder without a trace in a crowded bar seemed improbable, yet not entirely impossible. Could he have left through a hidden exit? The anchor posed, the image focusing on the floor plan of the Ugly Tuna. Investigators explored the possibility of staff-only exits. One led to a dimly lit back staircase and a construction site. But again, no trace of Brian was ever found, even in the rubble and hazards of the construction zone. Ethan thought of the bar's layout, the crowded dance floor, the dimly lit corners. Could there be a hidden way out, unnoticed by cameras, overlooked in the initial search? Was he abducted? The anchor questioned, the image now a close-up of Brian's missing poster. With no footage of him leaving the bar through the public entrance, some speculated abduction. But how could someone be abducted from a crowded bar without leaving any trace, without anyone seeing anything? The abduction theory seemed even more far-fetched. It implied a level of planning and execution that was almost unbelievable in such a public setting. The screen shifted again, this time to a photo of an older man, his face etched with sorrow. Brian's father, Randy Shaffer. Brian's father, Randy Shaffer, dedicated his life to finding his son. He never gave up hope, pursuing every lead, every tip for years. Tragically, Randy Shaffer passed away in 2008, without ever knowing what happened to Brian. Ethan felt a pang of empathy. The weight of unanswered questions, the unending grief, must have been unbearable. The image faded to black, leaving only the stark white words. Where is Brian Shaffer? To this day, the anchor's voice echoed in Ethan's mind, even with the muted TV. The case remains open, a cold case that continues to haunt investigators and baffle the public. No new leads, no fresh clues. Just an enduring mystery, a void where a young man once stood. The image on the screen slowly faded to black, Brian's face briefly superimposed before dissolving into the darkness. Ethan stared at the blank screen, the cacophony of the bar suddenly feeling muted, distant. The celebratory atmosphere seemed to deflate around him, replaced by a subtle unease, a chilling undercurrent. He looked around the Ugly Tuna, seeing it not just as a college bar, but as a stage for an unsolved mystery, a place where someone had vanished into thin air. Crazy, huh? Liam said again, nudging Ethan, like he just blinked out of existence. Ethan took another swallow of his beer, the taste suddenly bitter. Yeah, he said quietly, his gaze lingering on the entrance of the bar, the place where Brian Shaffer had last been seen. Crazy. He knew statistically, cases like this were rare, but tonight, in this bar, surrounded by the ghosts of Brian Shaffer and the unanswered questions, it felt chillingly real. The start of spring break, supposed to be a time of freedom and joy, was now tinged with the unsettling mystery of a young man who had simply disappeared, leaving behind nothing but questions and a haunting silence in the bustling heart of the Ugly Tuna Saloona. The mystery of April 1st, 2006 lingered, as potent and perplexing as ever. And tonight, in the very place where it began, it felt like Brian Shaffer was still here, somewhere, waiting for someone to finally solve his impossible vanishing act.